physiology. This is not just non-professional science, it's anti-science. Apart from fossils, another completely different kind of evidence supports evolution, evidence from homology. Here's a definition of homology. If we look at different modern species and find two similar structures represented by these two triangles, these structures are said to be homologous if it's believed that a common ancestor had a similar structure and all the intermediates also had that structure. The best evidence for homology comes from examining similarities that can't be explained by a design function in common between the structures. For instance, all vertebrate limbs share a similar skeletal structure having a single proximal bone, shown in pink, two distal bones, and topped off by smaller bones. But it's not clear what common design principles could underlie this similarity in limbs with functions as different as swimming, climbing, and flying. The simplest hypothesis to explain these similarities would be that the genes specifying these bones were present in a common ancestor of modern fish, birds, and mammals, and that copies of these genes determine the bone structures in each of the modern species. Modern molecular biology has supported this notion in that many of the same genes have been identified as participating in the development of limbs in chickens, frogs, mice, and humans. Of course, fins, wings, and arms are not identical, so not all the genes for these structures are the same. However, looking for homology in anatomic structures has been presented some difficulty because biology is very complex and we really don't understand all the principles that lead from genes in DNA to embryologic development and then to anatomic organs and tissues. So it's not always clear how to interpret whether certain similar structures are really likely to be homologous. Therefore, it makes more sense to look at homologies in the DNA itself. In fact, there's about 98% identity between the genes of humans and apes, indicating that these genes are homologous, that is, copied from a common ancestor that lived rather recently on the geologic time scale. But the ICR creationists suggest an alternative to the interpretation of copying from a common ancestor. They say that sequence similarities between apes and man simply reflect the creator's choice to design similar species to function similarly, not only at the level of bones, muscles, and organs, but also at the level of protein function. Hence the amino acid sequence and DNA sequence similarities. Well, both views seem consistent with the similarity data, but which view is correct? Well, one way to distinguish between copying and independent creation is suggested by analogy to a principle in copyright law. In 1946, when the publisher of a construction industry directory charged in court that another publisher plagiarized from his directory, he showed that errors present in his original appeared in the alleged copy. The courts judged that it was inconceivable that the same errors could have been made independently by the two publishers and ruled that copying had occurred. The principle that duplicated errors implies copying is now well established in copyright law, and in fact directory publishers now routinely include false entries in their directories to trap potential plagiarizers. Can errors, non-functional accidental quirks in the DNA of modern species be used as evidence of copying from ancient ancestors? Tonight I'll focus on one type of DNA error, the retroposons. You may remember from your biology courses that information normally passes from the genetic material DNA to RNA to protein. But sometimes a genetic accident occurs and the RNA gets reverse transcribed into DNA, and this DNA gets deposited back or retroposed at some random position in the cell's DNA to become a retroposon. One class of retroposons in our DNA look very similar to retroviruses like the AIDS virus, but they're harmless and are called endogenous retroviruses. In human DNA, there are about 10 major classes of endogenous retroviruses, each with as many as 50 scattered copies. Presumably, these represent viruses that infected our ancestors. Two other retroposon classes are designated line 1 and ALU sequences. Copies of these two retroposon sequences are very numerous in our DNA, with several 100,000 copies of each, comprising a substantial fraction of our total DNA. These retroposons are examples of so-called selfish DNA, sequences that are found in all higher animals and plants as well. Most of them confer no benefit to the host, but occur because as genetic parasites, they are capable of spreading copies of themselves, and the host has no way of getting rid of them. Occasionally, a retroposon inserts into a gene and destroys its function. For example, a line 1 retroposon insertion was found to be the cause of a defect in a clotting factor gene in a patient with hemophilia. Only normal clotting factor genes were found in the DNA of both parents, so the retroposon insertion must have occurred as a fresh event in the patient's generation or in his parents' reproductive cells. This example, and many others like it, indicate that retroposon insertions are still going on in our DNA as we speak. And this is supported by experiments showing new insertions occurring under laboratory conditions. However, most retroposon insertions land into the long DNA stretches between genes, and so they cause no health problems, and can therefore be passed on to future generations as trivial peculiarities in the DNA. You and your brother may share a particular retroposon that got inserted in your father's DNA. You and a cousin may share one that inserted in your grandfather's DNA, and to your parents and you. You and a very distant relative, may share one that inserted in the very distant past. How distant? Well, retroposons seem to spread in the DNA of all higher species. So according to the evolutionary view, some retroposons should have inserted millions of years ago in human ancestors living before our lineage diverged from the apes. Therefore, the evolutionary model makes a prediction that for many of our retroposons, we should find copies of the same retroposon in exactly the same places in the DNA of apes. And this prediction is verified by evidence found in DNA. If we look specifically for the location of endogenous retroviruses, many examples are in exactly the same position in human and chimpanzee DNA. When long DNA sequences have been compared between human and chimpanzee, one finds they're similar not only in the functional genes, but also in the spacer DNA, and in particular, the same line 1 and ALU retroposons are found in exactly the same position. Indeed, the presence or absence of specific retroposon insertions in our primate relatives fits exactly the predictions one could make based on the evolutionary tree of species relatedness that was constructed before Darwin based on anatomy. For example, this summary figure of the simian branches of our evolutionary tree shows retroposon A is an ancient retroposon that's shared by all the species shown up here. As you can see, it continues to all these modern species. Whereas C, apparently inserted after the divergence of macaques, and is found only in these species. Evolution makes many very specific predictions. For example, every retroposon shared by human and macaque should also be present in orangutan, gorilla, and chimp. And if a retroposon is found in human but not in chimp, like this one, it should not be found in any other species. And as far as I know, these and all similar predictions have been confirmed by the evidence. If you look on the website that I've indicated on the handout, you'll find a similar diagram showing how retroposons shared between whales and modern artiodactyls, like cows, support the evolutionary hypothesis that whales evolved from artiodactyls. So both fossil and homology arguments independently strongly support whale evolution from four-footed land mammals, a clear evidence of macroevolution. And by the way, my websites provide all the references to the professional literature. So you can check the evidence for yourself by looking up these articles. There are no bullfrogs in this argument. And any one of these examples would be sufficient to make a strong argument against the creation position of independent creation of man and apes. The appearance of the same error, that is, the same useless retroposon in the same position in human and ape DNA, cannot logically be explained by independent origin of these two sequences. The creationist argument that I mentioned earlier, that similarities in gene sequences simply reflect the creator's plan for similar protein function in similar species, that doesn't apply to retroposons because, with rare exceptions, these sequences do not have any function. A few retroposons lying close to functional genes may help control the expression of these genes, but there is no evidence that the vast number of retroposons that lie far from genes have any function. The possibility that the nearly identical retroposon sequences in chimpanzee and man, some of them thousands of nucleotides long, could have arisen independently by a series of chance mutations is so improbable that it can be dismissed. As in the copyright cases discussed earlier, these shared genetic errors indicate that copying of some sort must have occurred. Since there is no mechanism by which modern apes could DNA sequences could be copied into human DNA or vice versa, the existence of shared retroposons leads to the logical conclusion that for each case of shared retroposon, both the human and ape sequences are homologous and were copied from an ancestral retroposon that must have arisen in a common ancestor of human and apes. Other retroposons shared by other pairs of species provide support for other branches of the evolutionary tree. As an example, I've already mentioned the retroposon evidence linking whales and artiodactyls. These shared retroposons make a very strong homology argument for common descent and for macroevolution. Thank you.
We're given about to explain homology. Homologous structures, that is, the same structures in different animals, or similar structures in different animals, exist because they have been inherited from a common ancestor. Therefore, homologous structures are determined by homologous genes. The genes that code for these homologous structures must be similar in these different animals, if evolution is true. Therefore, homologous structures are determined by homologous genes, inherited from the common ancestor. Embryological processes and developmental pathways should be similar, if evolution is true. Assumption of the creationist theory. Homologous structures exist because the creators used similar solutions to provide for similar needs. All primates, including man, have grasping hands. We have keen eyesight and a relatively large brain because our way of life requires that. And so we share these characteristics in common, not because we inherited from the apes, but because we all needed that particular arrangement. Therefore, according to the creationist model, the genetics, the embryological processes, and developmental pathways of homologous structures may be quite different. Well, let's see what the evidence is. Assumption. All right, now, if homologous structures exist because they have been inherited from a common ancestor, as evolutionists say, then the assumed common ancestor must possess the same homologous structure. Isn't that simple? That's very straightforward, isn't it? What are the facts? Ooh, drew a blank, didn't we? What happened here? A fact. Most often, here's the fact, most often the assumed common ancestor does not possess the homologous structure. Let's see now. Let's look at it this way. Oh boy. Well, I got to go backward here. Oh, something's not showing up here. Now, let me explain. Very commonly, the assumed common ancestor doesn't even possess these structures. Now, here you've got two creatures, and they have the same homologous structure. similar structure. They assume that they possess this because they inherited from the common ancestor. That means the common ancestor would have to have it, wouldn't it? In most cases, the common ancestor doesn't even have it. They could not have inherited that similar structure, that homologous structure, from a common ancestor because the common ancestor had it, because the common ancestor doesn't have it. Oh, the evolution gets around that. It was evolution in common, you see. After they diverged, then each one evolved that structure. That's what they say. Now, there's many other problems here. Talk about the origin of the forelimbs, the trunk segment of a vertebrate. In the newt and amphibian, the forelimbs develop from trunk segments 2 to 5. In the lizard, which is a reptile, the trunk segments develop from the forelimbs develop from trunk segments 6 to 9. In the human, the forelimbs develop from trunk segments 13 to 18. Totally different. Development is totally different. Gavin de Beer in Evolution said this is an astounding fact. It was really puzzling. Really a great problem. Now, what about the alimentary canal of the vertebrates? What about its origin? In sharks, the alimentary canal comes from the roof of the embryonic gut cavity. In the lampreys and the newt, on the other hand, the alimentary canal develops from the floor, not the roof, the floor of the embryonic gut cavity. And frogs, well, they develop from the roof and the floor of the embryonic gut cavity, or from the blastoderm. Totally different. The development process is different. We missed something else there. Well, now, some of these things are not showing, unfortunately. Now, if these homologous structures have been inherited from a common ancestor, then the genes that code for those similar structures must be the same. You understand that? Now we have these two creatures. They've got homologous structures. They have similar structures, supposedly having inherited from the common ancestor. Now, if that is true, then the genes that code for these structures in this creature and this creature must be the same. They inherited from a common ancestor. That's why they have these similar structures. Well, let's see what the facts are. Here's a statement by Sir Gavin de Beer, British biologist, in this little booklet he published called Homology, an Unsolved Problem. Why was it an unsolved problem? Because the scientific evidence didn't fit evolution. What about it? He says here, it is now clear that the pride with which it was assumed that the inheritance of homologous structures from a common ancestor explained homology was misplaced. What is he saying? Now, we thought we had it, we could explain it. Why homologous structures exist? Because they inherited from a common ancestor. That's what we would expect on the basis of evolution. And we had the pride that we could explain that. But he says it was misplaced. Why? For such inheritance cannot be ascribed to identity of genes. The attempt to find homologous genes, except in closely related species, has been given up as hopeless. That destroys this evolutionary concept of homology. Let's see what some other people have to say about this. Louise Roth, The Biological Basis of Homology. She says this: it would appear that the title of de Beer's 1971 essay, Homology and Unsolved Problem, remains as an accurate description. In general, there is no necessary simple congruence. That is agreement between genetic, developmental, and evolutionary pathways, what they assume the pathways. They can't fit their hypothetical evolutionary pathways into this genetic evidence or the development evidence and so forth. The relationships between processes at genetic, developmental, growth phenotypic, and evolutionary levels remain a black box. They can't find any evidence. It's a black box. It doesn't fit at all. Totally contradictory to what an evolutionist would predict. Here's Rolf Stadler. What does he say? As De Beer in 1971 has pointed out, homology is still an unsolved problem. In general, the homology of structures such as organs or modules cannot be ascribed to inheritance of homologous genes or sets of genes. Consequently, organ homology cannot be reduced to gene homology. And Van Valen recognized this also. What's he saying? These so-called homologous genes are governed by, homologous structures are governed by different genes. They didn't inherit those genes from a common ancestor. They're different. Here's another evolution, Jerry Webster, the relations of natural forms and so forth. He says, as a final illustration, De Beer, 1971, observes that homology, conceived in Darwinian terms, remains an unsolved problem, since he can find no material basis for the supposed continuity, either direct or indirect, of the supposed individuals comprising morphological patterns. Look what they say. They find no basis for continuity. They cannot explain homology in Darwinian terms. They cannot explain the existence of these homologous structures based upon evolution. Can't do it. That is really, really, really troubling, isn't it? And they say that homology. Now, let's see. Let's go back. Let me see if I can. Well, some of these, no. Well, let me read what I have here. A man named G.P. Wagner. He said no satisfactory biological homology concept has been proposed so far. Why is it so difficult to find a biological basis of homology? He almost cries. We've tried all these years to relate the scientific evidence to evolutionary homology, and it doesn't work. This is what he suggests. The next step should be to evaluate explanations of similarity other than common descent. Give up on the Darwinian idea that these homologous structures exist because they have been inherited from a common ancestor. Give up on that. And base it on similar function, common materials, or limitation of design. Hey, that's what we creationists are saying. We're saying, don't try to explain homology, the existence of similar structures in different animals based upon some Darwinian evolution idea. Look on the basis of common design, common need, and so forth. And that's what this evolution is suggesting. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know why any evolutionist would try to defend evolution using homology, because it is just so contradictory to the facts. Now, let's go. I mean, his assumptions are totally destroyed. Now let's go to this matter of the fossil record. I hope we can get some of that fossil record. All right. Evolution would predict in vast number of transitional forms. We went from a little microscopic organism billions of years ago. Of course, nothing much happened for several billion years. We just had these little things running around for 3 billion years. Finally, they proliferated. And these little microscopic organisms evolved into complex invertebrates. We'll see some shortly. Then these invertebrates evolved into the fishes, which are vertebrates, fish into amphibians, amphibians into reptiles, reptiles into birds and mammals and so forth and so on. Finally, here we are, humans. Now listen, if that has happened, we should find no problem in discovering an enormous number of transitional forms. Growing from one kind to another requires millions of years. And the evolutionary doctrine tells us that the fittest are those that reproduce in larger numbers. Therefore, they replace the original because they are reproducing in larger numbers than the original. So we're going to have very huge populations of every one of these intermediate stages. And they would exist for millions of years. Plenty of time to leave all kinds of transitional forms. Now, today we would not expect to find all transitional forms, every transitional form that ever existed, even if evolution is true. We would not expect that, but we'd find many. We'd actually find an enormous number. Let's see what the facts are. Well, here we are. Good. Now, here's creatures that are found in so-called Cambrian rocks. Cambrian rocks are merely those rocks which contain fossils of trilobites and certain brachiopods. Evolution assumed they began to form about 530 million years ago. They used to tell us it was 600 million years ago. Somehow they've lost 70 million years. That doesn't bother evolution. What's the 70 million years among friends? So they had these rocks containing these creatures, almost all of which still exist today, except the trilobites. Enormous numbers of these creatures are found. Billions times billions of these creatures are found. They're very highly complex invertebrates. These rocks are scattered around the world. Now, generally underlying the Cambrian rocks are what are called Precambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe these Precambrian rocks were laid down in millions, hundreds of millions of years preceding and leading up to the Cambrian. Now, let us assume all this is true. Evolution is true. All these millions of years are true. And Precambrian rocks, by the way, many undisturbed Precambrian rocks are found, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils, no problem. What must we find? I don't say we should find. I don't say we probably would find. I'm saying we've got to find billions times billions of the fossils of the evolutionary ancestors of these creatures. Going from a single cell organism to these creatures. They're very complex. Here we see a trilobite, very complex creature. The eye of a trilobite has over 600 limbs. And each one of those limbs is perfect, free of distortion. What an incredible creature. Now we ought to find some evolutionary ancestors of these trilobites and the evolutionary ancestors of clams and snails and brachiopods and sponges and things like that. If evolution is true, we ought to find billions times billions of those things, showing something transforming from a little microscopic organism into these creatures. Well, we do find some fossils in Precambrian rocks, bacteria, things like that they claim, and some other soft-bodied creatures. But I'll tell you one thing, they have never found fossils of a single ancestor for one of these creatures. Not a single fossilized ancestor for these Cambrian animals have ever been found. Clams, snails, brachiopods, trilobites suddenly appear in a fossil record, complete, no trace of any ancestor, and no connecting form connecting these things to a common ancestor. Not one. No transitional forms whatsoever are found. Not one. Yeah, that's it. Yes. All right. Let's see what an evolutionist has to say about this. I hope we do. No, that comes later. I have a quotation from Douglas Fatum, an evolutionist. He says, "It is considered likely that all the animal phyla became distinct before the Cambrian, for they all appear fully formed, without intermediates connecting one phylum to another." Evolution is dead in the water. Ladies and gentlemen, we ought to find billions times billions of these transitional forms, showing the ancestors of all these creatures. Not one has been found. Just what did this man say? They all appear, what? Fully formed. And there are no transitional forms linking these things to a common ancestor. Not one. Evolution cannot be true. You can't have evolution that produced all of these things. All right. Now, what about the fish? Well, an invertebrate supposedly evolved into a fish. What is the evidence? Here's a man named Strahler. He was evaluating my book on the fossil record, and he came to fish. What did he say? In a series of quotations from Romer, 1966, Gish finds all the confessions he needs from evolutionists that each of these classes appears suddenly and with no trace of ancestry. The absence of the transitional fossils in the gap between each group of fishes and its ancestry is repeated in standard treatises on vertebrate evolution. This is one count in the creationist charge that can only evoke in unison from the paleontologist a plea of nolo contendere, no defense. Dr. Max, you have no defense. You cannot claim that anybody has ever found any fossils for these various kinds of fishes. You cannot claim they found transition forms linking them to a common ancestor. You cannot claim that we have evidence of all those millions of years of time when an invertebrate slowly and gradually during all that time evolved into the fish. Incredible! We are vertebrates. We love our ancestry. The greatest event in all of evolutionary history would be the origin of the vertebrates. There should be page after page, book after book, published about this tremendous event and give us some pictures of all these transitional forms. And they can't find even one. I have a book by Niles Eldridge, and I thought I'd see what this evolutionist has to say about the origin of fish. Couldn't find a word in his book about the origin of fish. Not a single word. I looked in the index to make sure I didn't miss something. Fishes are not there. He didn't want to talk about the origin of fish. Why? Because he has absolutely no evidence. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's all we need to say about origins as far as the fossil record is concerned. This debate is over with, ladies and gentlemen. It's absolutely over with. There's absolutely no fossilized ancestors for any of those complex invertebrates. Absolutely none. And there ought to be billions times billions of those things. There's no links linking those complex invertebrates to one another. Not a single one. There's not one single transitional form linking an invertebrate to a fish. Billions times billions of fossils of the invertebrate. Billions times billions of the fossil fishes. We ought to have billions times billions of fossils of the transitional forms, and they don't even have one. And Dr. Strahler says that's true. We don't have any defense, he says, against his claim. Well, that settles the matter, ladies and gentlemen. Well, there's much else. Here we have these marine reptiles, incredible creatures, not a single transitional form, not a single ancestor has been found for these things. They're all extinct today, of course, except the turtles. Then we have the flying reptiles. Oh, my goodness sakes. Can you imagine some reptile walking around on the ground and he has a mutation, makes his fourth finger just get a wee bit longer? And some reason that confers survival value, and so he replaces the original. And then 1,000 years later, he gets another one of those rare good mutations, makes his fingers a little bit longer. And after hundreds or thousands of these very rare mutations, the finger gets longer and longer and longer, and it gets long. And at the same time, would you believe it? Other mutations, accidental genetic changes, create the membrane, the wing membrane, the flight muscles, all that complex blood system and so forth and so on. And finally, we have these creatures. Oh, boy. Well, once you've got them, they can fly. Well, what in the world? What good is 2% a wing or 5% a wing? These things had 25% wings. They couldn't fly, and they couldn't run any longer either. Be goodbye, Charlie. And they don't have a single ancestor or transitional forms for any of these things. How much time do I have, Pete? 5 minutes? Well, I'm going to have to hurry. I'm going to have to skip some of this stuff. Here is a creature I found at the San Diego Museum of Man many, many years ago. About 30 years ago. Here was this creature, Ramapithecus. There he was. There's proof of evolution. If I ever saw proof of evolution, he wasn't a man, it wasn't an ape, he was intermediate. All they had of that creature at that time was a few pieces of the jaw and a few teeth. That's all they had. And based upon their faith in evolution, that's what they constructed. Well, I'm sure that convinced a lot of people the truth of evolution. Well, later on, they found additional material, and they were able to reconstruct him much more accurately Here's the skull of an orangutan, and there is the skull of the of Ramapithecus today. And look at it; it's exactly the same. He wasn't an ancestor man; he was the same as a modern orangutan. That's what he really looked like, right there, ladies and gentlemen. Not like the model in the museum. Then we have Piltdown Man, who was a fraud. I don't want to imply that all these things are fraud. No, that's not true. Piltdown Man, but here's the thing. Actually, the skull turned out to be a human skull. The jaw was an ape's jaw. What had happened? Somebody had taken the jawbone of an ape and a human skull, treated them with chemicals to make them look old, altered their teeth to make them look human-like, planted them in the gravel, and fooled the world's greatest experts. And it's amazing how many ape-like features those experts could see in that human skull, and how many human-like characteristics they see in that modern ape's jaw that weren't there at all. They were seeing what they wanted to see, what they thought they ought to see. Nothing but a fraud. And then we have the Nebraska Man. I'll have to hurry through that. Based upon one tooth, one single tooth. And here the Illustrated London News published this picture of Nebraska Man based upon the description of the scientist. There he was. There's the man. There's his wife. There's the tools they were using. All based upon one single tooth. Isn't science a fascinating subject? A few years later, they discovered some additional remains of this creature, and he wasn't an ape-like man or a man-like ape. It turned out to be a pig. It was nothing more than a pig's tooth. And that's what we get from a pig's tooth. And the Neanderthal people, let's see if we can get the Neanderthal man out of here somewhere. I'm sorry, we can't, let's go back. Let's see if we can find, no, he's in, I guess he's in the mist somewhere. We can't get the Neanderthal man. This just blows me right out of here. I want to show you that, evolution. Some evolution now believe that apes came from people rather than people coming from apes. Somebody actually saw to suggest that, and now I can't have my. Oh dear. Well, anyhow, I'll conclude this on the fossil record, where it says that evolution is a substance fossils hope for, the evidence of links unseen. Now, evolutionists will argue, we have some transitional forms. They're always questionable, always disputable. But in the case of those complex invertebrates, in the case of the fishes, there's absolutely no question. The evidence is crystal clear. And it settles the whole issue. Here is a statement, I hope we have it. Oh, good. By Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, an evolutionist. He wrote a book on evolution. And he invited comments from the readers. So a friend of mine wrote to him and said, Dr. Patterson, why didn't you include some actual transitional forms in your book? This is what he said. This is what Patterson said in a letter written to my friend. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustrations of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Here is an evolutionary paleontologist sitting among one of the greatest collection of fossils in the world. And he says, you're right. I don't have any examples of transitional forms in my book. But if I have known of any, either among the living or among the fossils, I certainly would have included them. Now, this man is an honest evolutionist. He came out and rated right on the line. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that man sitting there and didn't have any evidence for a transitional form, then I don't see how they can say, they have a lot of transitional forms. The fact is they don't have any. The fossil record, I think, demonstrates beyond doubt it kills evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, again, let me say that I just like to hammer this. You have all those complex invertebrates, incredible creatures. They just, boom, there they are in what they call the Cambrian explosion. There they are, all fully formed, not a trace of any ancestors or intermediates. Boom, all of a sudden, here's all these fishes. Errol White, famous evolutionist, expert on fishes, many years ago, he gave a talk on lungfishes at the presidential address, his presidential address at the Linnean Society in London. And when he said, but the lungfishes, like every other kind of fish I know anything about, has its origins firmly based in nothing. Nothing. Yes. Now, ladies and gentlemen, evolution should have billions times billions of those transitional forms, and they have not. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Obsessed with the Cambrian explosion, the rapid appearance of a variety of complex animal species about 540 million years ago. If these creatures evolved from earlier species, where are the fossils of those ancestors? Well, first of all, there is evidence for at least 6 phyla before the Cambrian period. So it's wrong to say that there are no precursors to the Cambrian species. But the Precambrian fossils are indeed very rare, and for good reason. These species were likely very small, and they were all soft-bodied, since teeth, bones, and exoskeletons had not yet evolved. So fossilization of recognizable individuals of these species would require very unusual circumstances. Very rapid entombment in very fine-grained mud capable of preserving soft body parts before they liquefied from bacterial decay. So if we expect Precambrian fossils to be rare because of their age and the small size and lack of hard parts in these early species, all leading to poor preservation, why not learn what we can from the species transitions that are well preserved in the fossil record? Creationists want us to draw broad generalizations from the examples where we have the least data, and ignore the evidence for macroevolution in the transitions where we have much more data, such as reptile to mammal, or the primitive whale fossils I discussed earlier. This doesn't make sense. He also quotes from Colin Patterson on the absence of transitional forms, a letter in 1979. Well, all the whale intermediates that I described were described more recently than that. Dr. Gish also intones we should find billions and billions of transitional fossils, but he ignores my explanation of why this is not the case. From the examples like Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands, we know that evolution proceeds most rapidly in small, localized populations, which make it unlikely that we'll ever find their fossils, as I described earlier. Now, concerning homology, Dr. Gish has said that in contrast to what evolution would predict, similar body structures that evolutionists claim are homologous can't really be so because they're specified in different species by non-homologous genes. And he frequently mentioned in earlier debates an example involving genes specifying the eye. But when I first heard him say this at a debate, I asked him what experimental evidence supported his claim that eye genes are not homologous in different species. In reply, Dr. Gish eventually sent me a 1958 instructional pamphlet by Dr. Gavin De Beer, whose quotes he put on the screen, which makes a similar claim about a gene called eyeless in the fruit fly Drosophila. But it turns out that the key experiments supporting this claim about eyeless were described in an article published in 1936 in a Russian journal inaccessible to me. I doubt that Dr. Gish ever read the details of these eyeless experiments either. He's satisfied that he can quote a respected authority supporting his view, and confident that his audience won't know that modern experiments have provided abundant evidence that De Beer's view is generally incorrect. In contrast to the few puzzling cases that De Beer mentioned in that 1971 quote, in the last 15 years, experiments have provided many examples where genes governing development of body structures have actually been isolated and characterized, and in all these cases I'm aware of, homology of structure is clearly associated with homologous genes exactly as evolution predicts. So here's an example. Several inherited disorders affecting the development of the eye and the nearby facial structures in humans have been found due to mutations in a gene known as PAX6. The PAX6 protein is expressed in the developing eye and switches on the expression of many eye-specific genes. Now, it turns out that mutations in the homologous PAX6 gene in mice also cause eye defects. And what to me is most impressive, the homologous PAX6 gene in the fruit fly Drosophila also governs eye development. In fact, PAX6 turns out to be the very same eyeless gene that was supposed to support Dr. Gish's argument that homologous genes do not specify homologous organs. In fact, the opposite is true. Flies that have these mutations in this gene have small abnormal eyes. And flies that have been induced to express PAX6 in abnormal places, like the leg or antenna, look like this. Here is an extra eye where an antenna should be, and here's one growing on a leg. And the same extra eyes are seen from expressing either the fly or the mouse PAX6 gene. These PAX6 results suggest the possibility that eyes of vertebrates and flies evolved from a primitive light receptor in a common ancestor of flies and vertebrates several 100 million years ago. And PAX6 is just one example of many where homologous genes are known to program homologous structures. So although Dr. Gish may be able to cite 50-year-old work by respected scientists who shared his incorrect views on homology, those scientists had an excuse that Dr. Gish doesn't have. The relevant experiments that disprove these views hadn't been done when the earlier scientists drew their conclusions. But Dr. Gish persists with these outdated views, choosing to ignore an enormous literature that contradicts them. Is this the kind of non-professional science we want in our schools, based on outdated, disproven theories? At a recent debate, Dr. Gish made an argument against homology that was new to me. He described how the inner ear of mammals has this beautiful structure where a tiny bone carrying vibrations from the outside causes vibrations in 3 parallel tubes coiled together like a snail, and it's actually 2 tubes because this green tube is kind of U-shaped, doubles back on itself, and then comes back to here. And between the green and blue tubes shown right here lies the organ of Corti with its 3 outer rows of hair cells and 1 inner row of hair cells that convert the vibrations into electrical energy that the nervous system can detect as sound. Evolution would predict a homologous organ in lower vertebrates, but Dr. Gish claims that the organ of Corti occurs in no reptile, and there is nothing in the reptile from which it could have evolved. Now, I stated at that earlier debate that I believed that lower vertebrates did have a similar, presumably homologous organ for hearing, but that it was shorter and not coiled the way it is in mammals. But I clearly wasn't certain, and I expect that Dr. Gish's confident claim was much more convincing to the audience than my uncertain rebuttal. Now, maybe it was elitist of me, but I believe it's because I'm a professional scientist, that when I went home, I actually checked the literature to see if Dr. Gish was right or whether this was another bullfrog-type argument. And my comparative vertebrate anatomy textbook showed these drawings of the internal inner ear of reptiles. This one, typical of crocodiles, has 3 parallel tubes, similar to mammals, a bone carrying the vibration from the outside. The green tube is U-shaped, as it was, as I showed with the mammal. And in between the blue and the green tube is an organ of Corti-like structure with 3 outer rows of hair cells and 1 inner row. This is the inner ear of a Dakota, a kind of lizard. It looks nearly identical to a mammalian organ of Corti. And here are the references, if you want to look these up. These are not bullfrog arguments. After the debate, I wrote a courteous letter to Dr. Gish requesting the references that would support his claim that reptiles don't have a similar organ in their inner ears. I received no reply. And so I can only conclude that Dr. Gish's claim about the mammalian organ of Corti having no possible homologue in lower vertebrates is another bullfrog-type argument, directly contradicted by evidence, even though it still resides on the ICR website, along with the other bullfrog arguments there. Now just imagine Dr. Gish making this claim about reptile inner ears in a paper submitted to a scientific journal. It would be refereed by experts who would immediately see that it was invalid. They'd demand references to support his claim. He couldn't supply any, and the paper would be rejected. End of story. Would that mean that the journal editors are prejudiced against creationism? I think not. This shows the value of using the professional scientific literature to filter out false claims, and it explains why science classrooms should teach only what's in that literature. Thank you.
Long before Lucy was found, yes, it is true that Zuckerman's publication on these Australopithecines were before they found Lucy. But these creatures that he was looking at were supposedly 1 to 2 million years younger than Lucy, more recent in time than Lucy. So if anything, they should be more human-like, if evolutionists are true and what they say is true. And furthermore, he said, why, if you suggested something about Lucy like I suggested, that'd be laughed at. Well, I'll tell you who published the articles, a lot of articles on it, Dr. Charles Oxnard, head of the department at USC, head of their graduate studies and so forth. Now at the University of Western Australia, in Western Australia. This man is an expert. I mean, he is a tremendous anatomist. And he studied Lucy. And he said Lucy and her fellow creatures were not intermediate between ape and man. They did not walk upright, and they certainly were not human ancestors. Now, you can laugh at that, Dr. Max, if you want to, but that's from Dr. Charles Oxnard, published in standard journals. Now, he said, we have these sequence of animals, and that proves evolution. Everything's in the right order, you know. Now listen, I don't care what order you have. What you have to have for evolution is the transitional form. Some documentation that one kind really did change into another kind. Not that one is found more recent in evolutionary belief and so forth, and those are found earlier. That's not the question. Really, did one change into another? Did one evolve into another? And there's some big problems for these people today. Down there in the Cambrian, what they call the early Cambrian, only those creatures have been found that I showed on the slide. So evolution said there weren't any fishes there. There weren't any vertebrates. They hadn't evolved yet. You know what? Just recently they found fossils of fish in what they call the lower Cambrian, the very beginning, right where all these creatures are that I showed on the slide. They found 500 specimens of this fish. Now, there's a bombshell on evolution. Here we have fishes down there. Now, the creationists said, what we said, well, the reason we didn't find the fossils of fish down in there is because these were bottom feeders, and if they were overwhelmed by a catastrophe, a flood or something like that, they would be buried first, and then the fish would be buried. Now the evolutionists, they have to say the same thing. How come they find the fossils of the fish down there? And they'd never found it for 150 years. They've been looking for fossils of fishes and never found them down there. So, well, obviously, they hadn't evolved yet. That's why they're not found there. Now they are found there. Where did they come from? How come they're down there? Early Cambrian, why was it just supposed to be those creatures down there? And another thing, they said no large mammals existed with the dinosaurs and never found them. They hunted and did all this all over the world. Never found a large mammal with dinosaurs. Now they have. A dog-sized mammal. And another mammal, a large mammal, smaller than that. It had in its stomach contents, it had a baby dinosaur. It had eaten the dinosaur rather than the dinosaur eating it. Now, why haven't they found those things down there in all the years they've been looking and studying and trying to find these things? Well, That's again the creationist argument. They were keeping a respectful distance from one another. They didn't live in the same area. Now that's the only thing the evolutionists can say. We found it. They existed at that time, but we never found them before, and he just found very few of them. I guess he just didn't hang around down there so far. And what we use is this ecological niche. Evolution always bring up some of these other explanations which really aren't too good. But what the creationist really says, we existed in different ecological niches, in different places and so forth. And they've got the appeal to the same thing. Now they've been saying that chimps and man, chimpanzees and man, were closely related. The genetics is 98.6% similar. The only difference is 1.4% difference between human genetics and the genetics of the chimpanzees. I don't have time to go into to tell how they discovered, how they believe they found this out. It had nothing to do with studying the actual genes or anything. Well, now they have actually determined the sequence of the nucleotides in the human gene and the chimpanzee genome. They're able to actually compare one to the other. And they found 68,000 insertions and deletions. Here they took a chromosome of the chimpanzee and supposed to be the similar chromosome in the human. They worked out all the sequence of all the nucleotides and compared them and found 68,000 insertion places where something was stuck in and something was removed. 68,000 insertions and deletions, which they hadn't realized before, and 83% of the genes that code for proteins were different. The proteins were different, 83%. But just like the creationists always said, we're just not that closely related to a chimpanzee. Like I've always said, anytime somebody says, oh, we're that close to being a chimpanzee, oh, we're just practically the same as a chimpanzee, 98.6% similar, I'll believe it the day you allow your daughter to date a chimpanzee. Now, all these things about retroposons, I don't think you understood a word he was saying about these things. That's not evidence for evolution. That's evidence that these things can work in the reverse direction. And that makes it more incredible. Ordinarily, DNA is transcribed into RNA, which then is converted into something else. Now they got some of these things that go in the reverse, that take the RNA and make a DNA out of it, and they can do that, go in the reverse direction. And that's supposed to be evidence for evolution. That's the system that actually exists right now. It's a very useful thing. He says, well, we have found a function for a few of these things. But, that doesn't mean much. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, there's this so-called junk DNA. And they said, oh, that's DNA is just junk. It's not doing a thing. The creation says, no. God created that. That's not junk. It has a purpose. Now they're finding all kinds of active genes in that so-called junk. They're finding actual function for these. And the pseudogene, I'm surprised he didn't bring that up with the last debate we had. I believe he talked about pseudogenes. Supposed to be evidence for evolution. Now they're finding functions for these pseudogenes. And eventually we'll find the function for all of those things. And so the retroposons just give us some time and we'll find the function for these things. Just like they used to say the tonsils and the appendix were just leftover vestiges. They didn't do any good. Just left over from our evolutionary ancestry. Well, we find out that the tonsils and the appendix are very, very important structures and many other things. And so that evidence has been discarded. Now, about whales. They have a creature that was totally living on the land. And they said the whale evolved from this thing. Now here is a creature that lived on the land just like a wolf. And Robert Carroll says, well, since he was the ancestor of the whales, we're going to call him a whale. Here's a creature that's just like a dog or a wolf or something like that, and they're going to call him a whale because they believe now, because the teeth were similar to what we find in whales, that this was the ultimate ancestor. Good night. If you can call a wolf a whale, why, you don't have any trouble finding intermediates. And some of these other creatures they say were ancestors for whales were creatures that lived on the land. And they make up all these just so stories. But you know what? He says that we don't find ancestors for those Cambrian animals because they came from soft-bodied creatures. Absolutely not. Those creatures that had hard parts, they could not have evolved directly from a soft-bodied creature because the way the structures are integrated with its hard parts. And that's just excuses. He's trying to explain why they don't find transitional forms. I don't have to make excuses why we don't find transitional forms because we predict you wouldn't find transitional forms. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you right now, there is no question that every one of those Cambrian animals appears fully formed. And there are no ancestors, just like Dr. Fatuma, that evolutionist, said. There's no ancestors. There's no intermediates. And there's certainly none for the fishes, not a one. Dr. Max didn't even try to answer that. I'm glad he didn't. He shouldn't do it because Dr. Strahler says he doesn't have any defense, nolo contendere. Well, I wish we had much more time. There's so much more we'd like to say, ladies and gentlemen. But what I'm saying is this, the weight of the evidence is solidly on the side of the creation. And you know it's very important, isn't it? If evolution is true, you know what Richard Dawkins, this famous evolutionist, said, that faith is worse than smallpox, only harder to get rid of. And so they say our faith, just like smallpox, are worse. Listen, if evolution is true, you're nothing. You came from nothing, and you're going to end up with nothing but a pile of dust, and that's it. That's all the destiny you have. But if creation is true, we have a God who's our creator. And if God is our creator, he's also our Lord and our master. And there's a relationship between the created and the creator. And God controls our destiny. And it makes a tremendous difference. If we sit here, I don't care how much a guy believes in God, if he's teaching kids that this evolution is true, and we came out of this Big Bang, that student's going to sit there, who needs God? We don't need God. We came from hydrogen gas, and we've evolved from the apes and so forth. And who needs God? There is no God. And if there is no God, there's no one to whom I am responsible. I am only responsible to myself. And I think the teaching of this theory of evolution, indoctrinating, it's not education, it is indoctrination. Teaching in our public schools, our tax-supported public schools, teaching that as fact without allowing any evidence for creation is it's a religion that they've got in those schools. Violating academic freedom, violating freedom of religion. And I say our kids ought to hear this evidence that you've had the privilege of hearing tonight. And I thank Dr. Max for coming to present the evolution side. That's what we want, both sides to be presented. Let the students decide for themselves what they think is right. And if we tried to get evolution out of the schools, that would be violating their academic freedom and their freedom of religion. No, we wouldn't want to do that. Just say, let's teach both. Thank you very much.
Here's what we're going to do. I know it's late, but it's part of the debate. They're going to have a format here where one asks the question, the other one answers, back and forth for about 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll be finished. Is that okay? Let's do it, okay? All right, let's proceed.
Okay.
I think I'm supposed to ask the first question.
I guess you, yeah, okay.
So I wanted to ask a question concerning thermodynamics. I grant you that the order represented by light, or the clustering of matter in the universe that you described, may involve some negative or decreased entropy, but you would have to grant that the radiation of useless energy into space from the stars and our sun represents positive entropy. So how can you claim that the negative entropy from the organized stars or life outweighs the positive entropy from stellar radiation unless you actually quantitate the two and determine which is bigger and which is overrides the other, like calculating a profit when you look at your gross income and your expenses. How can you do that without quantitating both of them, which you haven't done?
Well, if you have a universe that's nothing but hydrogen gas, and it's highly dispersed out to a temperature of 10 degrees above zero, and it's almost a perfect vacuum. Compare that to the present universe, and if you say this universe we have today is not more complex than that, I don't know how we can get around this. Now, if from this Big Bang, if those gases continue to expand forever, we would have no problem with the second law of thermodynamics. We wouldn't be here to think about it. But they didn't. That highly dispersed gas somehow formed stars and galaxies. And when a star forms from some kind of a nebula, you get a negative negative entropy change, and that means you can't do it. It wouldn't happen spontaneously.
Well,
Evolutionists say that then there was a nearby supernova or something that pushed it and made it form. And what I'm saying is that highly dispersed thing is certainly less complex than what we have today. So we had an increase of order and complexity, and therefore a decrease in entropy, which is forbidden.
Okay, so I think I have a comment after yours, and then you have another one. Yes, you've explained why you think that the clustered matter of stars represents a decrease in entropy. But don't you agree that the stellar radiation that's radiating uselessly out into space represents an increase in entropy? So there are two factors. You're trying to say there's a profit looking only at your income and neglecting the expenses. Yes, there is a clustering of stars, and yes, life is complex. What about stellar radiation?
Well, let me put it this way. The natural laws and natural processes which now govern this universe are causing its death and destruction. Now, how can you believe that these natural laws and natural processes which are now destroying the universe and causing its ultimate death, how could they be responsible for its origin? Because you believe these natural laws are all there is and all there ever has been. How could they create it and then destroy it? How can that be true? It's not rational.
I think the format now gives you the question. Yeah.
Trilobites, in principle, had perfect vision. They possessed the most sophisticated eye lens ever found in nature. How could random, accidental, genetic errors in DNA molecules or mutations enable the trilobite to invent and utilize Fermat's principle, Abbe's sign law, Snell's law of refraction, and the optics to birefringent crystals to construct eyes with perfect, undistorted vision? Furthermore, how would the trilobite know that underwater each lens had to be doubled to avoid distortion? So he created a double lens. Every lens is double. How could that happen? How could this trilobite discover these laws and principles of optics and utilize them to create a perfect eye? By random genetic errors.
Well, I don't know that much about trilobites, but similar arguments have been made by creationists to ask how the vertebrate eye could form with a complex lens and a retina and so forth. And that actually has been addressed by...
You're not answering my question, Dr. Max.
You're right. I'm answering something closely related to it that I think reflects the same principle. Nielsen and Pelger, two scientists, published an article showing that if they made a computer simulation where they allowed small changes in various properties of starting with a simple eye spot, similar to what you might find in a clam, with just a few light-sensitive cells. And if you allowed for 1% change in various properties per generation, including bending, slight bending or a slight change in refractive index, you could eventually, in only, I think it was 1,800 steps, each determined by a 1% change in these parameters, you could arrive at a vertebrate eye, which is, to my mind, just as complex and beautiful as a trilobite eye. And they estimated that this could occur, and they also demonstrated that various eyes in species that are living today have eyes that look approximately like some of those steps on the way to evolution of a complex vertebrate eye that makes use of the same optical principles as you described.
Let me respond to that. Now, you have different kind of eyes in invertebrates. But you don't tell us how we went from one stage to the other stage. You have different kind of eyes. And you look at those and you say, look at these differences. But how did you get from one stage to the other? Now, furthermore, about the vertebrate eye, I have some material on that. This is what this man says, expert on eyes. The vertebrate eye that you and I have is possessed by every other vertebrate. And that vertebrate eye is found in the most primitive form of vertebrate we have, what they call which is a hagfish or a lamprey. They say the hagfish is the most primitive vertebrate that ever existed. It's more primitive than anything you find in a fossil record. It's more than anything you find today. It's living. We have this hagfish today, and he has the same vertebrate eye that you and I have, just as complex. And there is nothing going from the vertebrate eye back to the invertebrate. And that's what the man was saying in his article. There's no use even talking about the origin of the vertebrate eye. Now, the invertebrate eye, there's a problem, because the most complex of these invertebrate eyes are found in what are supposed to be the most primitive invertebrate, while some of the most primitive eyes are found in what are supposed to be the most highly advanced invertebrate. You don't get a nice sequence or anything like that. There's nothing like that. True. And there's absolutely no evidence. I know there's no use even talking about an evolutionary origin of the vertebrate eye. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever for the origin of the vertebrate eye. How it appears with the first vertebrate. And there's just no evidence for it. None whatsoever.
Okay, well,
And I'm telling you one thing. Notice, ladies and gentlemen, he didn't answer my question about the trilobite eye, how it could have been able to use all these very incredible things to construct the perfect eye. I know, Dr. Max, don't be discouraged because no other evolutionists have ever been able to explain it either.
One thing I would remind you that evolutionists get criticized a lot for telling just so stories. But when you ask us about the evolution of a soft body part that's not found in any fossil, what are we going to do other than a just so story? So you put us into a kind of trap. In fact, we know very, very little about the evolution of an eye or any other soft body tissue because we have very little evidence for it. So we can't go from fossils. That's why we can learn. We have a few clues from kind of biochemical evidence that I already talked to about PAC6 and about other genes that are specific for eye development that are shared between various species. But it doesn't seem quite fair to me to put evolutionists in a position of asking them to tell you a just so story because there's no evidence, and then criticizing them for telling you a just so story. The fact is, we don't have the evidence. These are soft body parts, and they're not fossilized.
Well, Dr. Max, the shell and so forth of a vertebrate is a hard part.
But there are no eyes.
Now, and I'm not talking about knives. You say they evolved from soft-bodied creatures, and that's why we don't have transitional forms. And I pointed out that the creature with a hard part could not have evolved from just a simple soft-bodied creature, because there's an integration between the soft tissue and the hard part. And you just can't go from a simple soft-bodied creature to an animal with hard parts. You can't do it.
Well, you know,
And
animals...
so to say that they all evolved from soft parts, that's why we don't find their ancestors. Look, we find fossils of bacteria. You claim we find fossils of bacteria in the rocks. If we can find fossils of bacteria, little one-celled soft-bodied creatures, we could certainly find fossils of all the other soft-bodied creatures leading to these Cambrian animals. If that's what they evolved from, we certainly ought to find them, and we don't.
I would just remind you that that this is not the age of mammals. This is the age of bacteria. There are billions more bacteria existing now on Earth than any other species, and so there are a lot more records for bacteria that we can see than animals. But let me just...
So you're supposed to ask me another question?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I lost the
You want to ask me a question?
Okay, yeah. So I've argued that many of your claims are similar to the bullfrog one. I'm sorry to keep harping on it, but I wanted some short term to...
next time I'm gonna grunt like a frog here. That's for sure.
Oink,
oink, oink.
I wanted some short term to characterize what I think reflects a lot of your arguments, that they work well at debates, but when you scrutinize them, you find that there's no data. And
yes, there is.
And you mentioned I mentioned a number of these where I think that fall into the category of debates, points you've previously made that I think are erroneous. And while you admitted that the bullfrog argument about the bullfrog proteins is erroneous, you did,
No, I did not. No, I did not. I say I got that from an evolutionist.
Right.
Well, I don't know whether it's erroneous or not.
You admit that there's no data to support it. So what I wonder is if there are any of these other arguments that I mentioned and I claimed were bullfrog-like, and that there's no evidence to support them, that perhaps you now believe may in fact be unsupportable. And I'd just like to run through a few and just ask you, without discussing any of the implications for evolution, whether these debate points that you previously made you still think are correct. Like, for instance, you challenged when I first made the antibody argument. You said that's controversial, and you're surprised Dr. Max believes that the antibody mutations occur. I'm wondering if you think that's correct. In previous debate, you said Basilosaurus was a reptile. I'm wondering if you think that's correct. In previous debate, you said reptiles don't have a hearing organ similar to the mammalian organ of Cordy. I showed you the slides. I'm wondering if you think that's correct. In a previous debate, you said even tonight, you said random mutations can never be beneficial. I'm wondering if you still think that's correct. And you also said homologous organs are not specified by similar genes. I told you about PAC6, and I had one slide I didn't get to talk to that lists about 10 other genes that have been found to be all involved in limb formation in chick, in frog, in mouse, and in man. So those are 5 things. I'm wondering if you...
All right, now, about the antibodies. What I denied was you said that our antibodies are produced by random mutation. You were comparing it to Darwinian evolution and the production of mutations that we would suffer from time to time. I said this: absolutely, the origin of those antibodies could not be the product of just these kind of these mutations that we talk about, where we get sickle cell anemia, where we get diabetes, where we get this or that by these mutations. And that's what you were representing. Now, when I studied the problem, when I got a book on embryology, and I have a book of 700 pages on immunology, which he said, all this stuff just evolved by chance. Here it takes 700 pages to describe this immunological system. When I got that and I studied it, and which I documented, this system, this so-called hypermutation process, is not some random genetic mistakes. It had been engineered. It had been designed to do this, and it involved a very complex system, interactions and so forth and so on. It was deliberate, and it was beneficial, not these destructive kind of mutations you were trying to relate them to.
Excuse me, what I said was antibody mutation occurs in all of us, and you said, Dr. Max, I'm surprised you believe that. If that did, we'd all die of infection. You
Yes.
denied it occurred.
All
Let's
right.
talk about Bacillus
No, not just a minute. Now, just a minute, Doctor. I read the debate you had with Lee Spetner, Dr. Spetner, on this very thing, and you said that this
My question refers to
hypermutation.
what you said at an earlier debate. It
Yes,
doesn't
and
refer to
I'm
Dr.
saying that these antibodies are not produced by what you were inferring at that time. Very, very definitely not.
Is Bacillosaurus a reptile, as you said?
Bacillosaurus. Barbara Stahl in evolution said Bacillosaurus could not possibly be the ancestor.
What I
of
asked
any
is
creature.
Bacillosaurus a reptile, as you claimed at an earlier debate?
I don't know whether it is or not.
Okay.
All right.
And
Now,
what
the
about
organ of Corti, as far as I know, the organ of Corti is only found in the mammal.
well, what you said was
Now,
that
wait
in
a
a
minute.
reptile
I'm
there's
saying
nothing
it's only
resembling it.
found in the mammal.
What you said is there's nothing resembling it, and the quote
What I'm
that I
saying,
showed-
I didn't know of anything that it could have evolved from. That's what I said. Now,
what
if you
said
found,
in
all right.
there was nothing resembling it in a reptile. That's what the acts and facts thing.
I said I didn't know of anything it could have evolved from. The organ of Corti is a highly complex structure found only in mammals. Now, furthermore, Dr. Max, if some bones from the jaw were brought up into the ear of from a reptile, some reptile had some bones in the jaw that came up into the ear and gave him the ear that you and I have, the mammal has, then that means that this columella, which is attached to the tympanic membrane, had to be loosened, and these bones had to be stuck up on there to attach it to the tympanic membrane, and these bones had to be re-engineered. You can't just take a couple of bones from the jaw and stick them up in your ear and hear with it.
So what I'm asking is, in the reptile, is there an organ similar to the
I don't.
organ of Corti?
Let me put it away. I still don't know of
And
anything.
the pictures
Now,
that I showed you with the
well,
references to the
okay.
literature, do you
No,
think they're false, or do you think they're
No,
manufactured?
I'm not saying that.
Okay.
Now,
you can see
but-
how easy it is, how difficult it is to get a direct answer about a question when an evolutionist can't support a claim that he made.
Now, wait a
What
minute.
about random mutations, which you
mutations.
said can never be beneficial?
I have no information on a mutation that is beneficial. They talk about the sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia. Now, if you inherit one of the genes, you can see you get two genes, one from the mother and one from the father. If you get one of these genes for sickle cell, and you get the normal gene from the other parent, you're going to survive. You can produce a pretty good supply of hemoglobin. And so, but now you have resistance to malaria. So evolution says that mutation is a good mutation. It gives him resistance to malaria. But just a minute. If he marries someone which also has one of those genes, 1/4 of their children are going to die of sickle cell anemia. So the overall result is not beneficial. More people survive malaria, but more people die of sickle cell anemia. As a matter of fact, if you didn't have that resistance to malaria, this sickle cell trait would probably be eliminated because all these people would die of sickle cell anemia.
Are any random mutations beneficial is what I asked.
I don't know of it.
Okay, and the bacterial examples that I gave you, you don't know about them either.
No,
There's a lot
no.
you don't know about.
You
That's
see-
good. What about putatively homologous organs are not specified by similar genes? I listed TAC6 and there are a number of
Now,
other...
wait a minute. Wait a minute.
TBX1, TBX5, TBX4, bone morphogenic proteins, all found in chick limb, mouse limb, human limb.
Just a minute. Okay. Now there are some genes called the Hox genes that are the overall, determine the overall structures that are found in these various things. But the genes that code for our eyes are very different from that of a fish. They are different. I don't deny that the genes that govern our eyes are the same that we find in the fish. They're different. Yet we have this homologous structure. They're governed, and how would it be that right up to 1990, these scientists were unaware of the fact that similar genes coded for these so-called homologous structures?
Well,
how come they were so ignorant of that?
The last 15 years, there have been some discoveries.
Oh,
that have
yes,
been made.
I know it.
The date, the most recent date of those quotes that you supplied on the slide was 1984.
Yes.
1984.
1988, I think.
Okay. Well, maybe a few of those scientists writing those reviews weren't reading the literature any better than you. But there's been a lot of discoveries made in the last 15 years. The PAC6 gene stuff is all in the past 10 years.
Now, Dr. Max, here are those experts on homology, evolution. And they said that not only in the differences in the genes, but difference in the mode of development, a difference in this, difference in that. They said, therefore, we don't know how to explain homology from a Darwinian point of view. We can't do it.
Well,
not only the genes were different, but many other differences. It didn't agree with what evolutionists expect at all, and you're leaving all of that out.
I am leaving it out, and there's a good reason I'm leaving it out. Dr. Gish, let me ask you, what are the genes that cause the embryologic development of the eye?
I'm not talking about the eye. I'm talking about other things.
What are the genes that cause the embryologic development of the bone?
Of the bones? I don't know.
What are the genes that cause everything?
I don't know.
Okay, well, that's the point. We don't know. We don't know the genes that cause a lot of embryologic development. So that's why, at this point, if we can't even explain the genes in a living animal, what causes the embryologic development, how can anybody expect us to know how those evolve?
Why can't you explain that?
Well,
why can't you do that? Why shouldn't you be able to do that if evolution is true? You say you can't do it. I agree you can't do it. Why shouldn't you be able to do that?
Because it's very complicated.
Oh,
we have
complicated.
embryologists now trying to study all these things. And the genes, we do know many of them, and as I said, many of them are found to be homologous genes, but we know only a small fraction of what causes embryologic development. So to me, it's not surprising.
No, wait a minute. Now, wait a minute. I gave the data where they cited where these various things originated during the development of the embryo. They do know that. And one is developed from the gut cavity, from the floor of the gut cavity, the other the roof of the gut cavity, and so forth and so on, and all that sort of thing.
What genes are responsible for that?
For
we can't understand how those things evolved until we know what the genes are.
Wait a minute. The development was very, very different, and you cannot fit. Now, wait a minute, Dr. Max. All right.
It's your turn to answer.
Let me one more thing. You talk about homologous.
You have another question to ask?
Now, I want to ask you one thing. If homologous structures exist because they inherited from a common ancestor, why doesn't the common ancestor have that structure? How could it be?
Okay, let me answer that with a question.
No, just answer.
What are you talking about? What homologous structure are you talking about that doesn't exist in
There are many examples.
Name one.
Now, wait a minute. I'm quoting these authorities that I had. Now, wait a minute. It's just like I say, the sort of poor Chinese are dying of starvation. You say, name one. Just give me the name of one.
Well, it's hard for me to answer the question when I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay, all right. Let's go to something else. Who's supposed to ask the next question?
I think you asked the next.
I'm supposed to ask the next question. Well, I don't know if I asked you about the Cayman animals because you just say that. And that's that. How do you explain the evolution of incipient stages of complex structures, such as wings, which can only function when complete with feathers, muscles, blood vessels, nervous system, and so forth? How can such a creature either fly or run on the ground with 25% wings? Bowden has got 25% wings. How could it fly? And how could it run around on the ground with 20? These incipient stages, not functional, they're just part way.
Well, there have been a number of hypotheses about how flight got started in birds. And as you know, there's some question that maybe initially a poorly primitive wing might have served just for gliding, the way squirrels, these flying squirrels can glide. But I agree that an animal with what we might call a primitive wing would be less successful than an animal with a well-developed wing. What I find it difficult for me to understand why you can't see that means that the evolution would move rapidly in that case, and the animals that had developed a more advanced wing would very quickly overtake the ones with the partially formed wings, and that would mean that we'd have a very limited population of transitionals, which would completely explain why they're difficult to find.
Some just so story, if I ever heard one.
Well, when we don't have data and you ask for
Yeah.
an answer, we can only give, it's like that trap I was talking about. When we don't have the data, all we can do is try and fill in hypothesis.
Stephen J. Gould cited St. George Mivart back in the 1800s. He said that the failure of natural selection is the total useless nature of incipient structures. And Stephen J. Gould published an article, he says that's still the hardest thing for an evolutionist to answer and to explain. You've got something that's starting to form. It does nothing. Can't function.
Well, I've heard the similar...
Wait a minute. Hold it. This creature can't fly with 2% of wing or 5% of wing. He can't run any longer either.
But he can glide.
He's going glide. Gliding squirrels. You glide, as the evolutionists say, birds or flying creatures didn't evolve from something like that because the muscles are totally different. They restrict movement that you need for flight. You didn't evolve from something like that. The incipient, even a gliding squirrel, when that started to develop, and he'd jump out and try to glide with a 5% of whatever it needs to glide with, he's going right down and he's going to lose his life. Even the incipient stages of those things wouldn't function. You can see.
I think we have a 10-minute conclusion now, please, or do you want to call it short? Okay, so a summary of what I presented tonight is on the handouts. Well, I guess, so what happens to our slides? We lost the slide man? All right. Okay. So I just wanted to tell you that there's a summary of what I presented on your handouts, and I hope you'll look them up. Now, the evidence I provided for evolution is clearly consistent with evolution, but does it prove evolution? It doesn't. And actually, no scientific knowledge is based on the unassailable kind of proof that supports mathematical theorems. Instead, science advances by the accumulation of clues sought by persistent detectives who try and derive logical and unbiased deductions from these clues. Like a jury presented with these clues, we try to arrive at the most likely verdict, even though we recognize our facts are incomplete. There are no witnesses to the eons of evolution, so we must do the best we can with the clues at hand. But in this respect, evolution is no different from other scientific disciplines. There are no witnesses who have seen the core of the Earth, or a black hole, or the DNA code for a gene. In all these cases, scientists also work by accumulating indirect clues and testing predictions of competing hypotheses. So the creationist attempt to single out evolution as only a theory and somehow less solid than the other sciences is clearly unjustified. Whenever several kinds of independent evidence all support a single model, and that model wins acceptance in the professional scientific literature, and in that literature, evolution is just as accepted as theories of geology, physics, chemistry, and astronomy. It's possible that sometime in the future we'll uncover valid evidence that will challenge evolution, and if this occurs, I would be happy to see such evidence taught in science classrooms. Now, although creationists have made no contribution to the professional scientific community, it still sounds unfair to some folks, and I heard it tonight, that evolutionists would try to keep an opposing viewpoint out of the classroom. To understand why I don't think it's unfair at all, suppose someone presented the following argument against the validity of the biblical story of creation. Suppose he said, well, the creation story can't be true because God created the fishes on day 2, but didn't create the oceans and the rivers until day 4. So none of the fish could have survived, since no fish can live out of water for 2 days. Therefore, the biblical account of creation must be wrong. Does this argument deserve equal time in the Bible study classroom? It's certainly true that fish can't survive out of water, and the argument may convince an audience that doesn't know the details of Genesis. But if you know enough of Genesis to realize that it actually describes the creations of the oceans before the fish, exactly the opposite of the version that I just quoted, then this phony argument, with its gross misrepresentation of the Bible, may fill you with outrage and anger. And that's exactly the way some scientists feel when they hear ICR representatives persuading lay audiences with arguments about bullfrog proteins or reptile hearing organs. Some arguments are so bad they don't deserve to be heard anywhere, and certainly not in science classrooms. Now, I'm sure that there are many in tonight's audience who would say, I don't care if creation science is non-professional. I prefer it because it supports what I know from the Bible is correct. And anyway, what does it matter if our students accept one or another theory about the ancient history of life? Well, in my view, the real harm has nothing to do with evolution itself. The problem is this. The students now in our schools are going to be running our great country in a few decades. Increasingly, they're going to be making decisions for which scientific data and scientific logic will be critical. If they're taught that it's okay to give equal weight to data and logic that can't meet the rigors of peer-reviewed scientific publication, they will not be learning how to make the best decisions. Dr. Gish and former ICR President Henry Morris have both written that regardless of the evidence, their own literal interpretation of the Bible rules out the possibility of evolution. And ICR staff have to sign an oath affirming creationism. And you can see how in their eagerness to find evidence to support their biblical exegesis, they embrace erroneous information, like Dr. Gish's bullfrog data and the reptile ear that could never pass scrutiny of professional science. Their philosophy of conclusion first, evidence later, is exactly the opposite of the scientific method, which requires scientists to collect evidence and be ready to change their conclusions if the evidence points that way. This is why I think it is so important that creation science be kept out of science classrooms. When decision makers override scientific evidence for non-scientific reasons, catastrophe can result, because you can't fool Mother Nature. When Russians decided that political considerations overrode scientific evidence of genetics in the days of Lysenko, they set Russian biology and agriculture back 30 years. In 1986, when NASA decision makers at the Challenger shuttle launch set aside engineering concerns about the effects of cold temperatures, they sent a multi-million-dollar space shuttle and 5 astronauts to their doom. And today, because the president of South Africa has been unable to discriminate between good and bad science about whether the HIV virus causes AIDS, he may have unwittingly condemned millions of his countrymen to death from AIDS. The 21st century will bring increasing challenges requiring scientific reasoning both from leaders and from the common citizens of tomorrow. From questions about global warming, nuclear waste disposal, biodiversity conservation, vaccine safety, it's our responsibility to provide our students with the best possible science education, one that will help them steer through the fog of various false pseudoscientific claims motivated by politics, by greed, and yes, by religion, rather than by science. They must learn how to recognize good science from bad, and that scientific claims that don't even meet the standards for publication in the scientific literature can't be given equal time. Quality science education matters. Now, I've stressed the importance of relying on professional science, but we should also recognize that science doesn't have all the answers. To make wise decisions and to live meaningful and fulfilling lives, we need not only scientific knowledge, but also the capacity for empathy, ethical behavior, moral courage, all outside the realm of science. These are areas where religion can play an important role. Therefore, I believe faith should be cherished. In fact, I would respect anyone's faith that the origin of species occurred exactly as described in the Bible. No one is obligated to believe in their heart only what's been verified by science. However, anyone who feels this way should recognize that if a belief is based on faith rather than evidence, it has no place in a science classroom. By the same token, there is no place in the science classroom for the idea that scientific evidence for evolution disproves God. Any science teacher who claims that science disproves God should certainly be rebuked, since atheistic conclusions are not part of the professional science literature any more than creationism is. So yes, creationists are right in opposing anti-religious teaching in the science classrooms. I would agree with them. But creationists are wrong when they claim that atheism itself is an essential part of the science of evolution. Evolution is accepted by many deeply religious people of various faiths who understandably resent the intolerant creationist implication that their religious faith is somehow illegitimate because they accept evolution. Evolution does not imply atheism or immorality, as creationists often claim. And the ICR argument that evolution itself is a religion is utterly absurd. The evidence for evolution that we discussed tonight is purely based on direct observations interpreted by the scientific method, as in the examples that I showed you. There is nothing religious about the way shared retroposons support a common ancestor between human and ape, or between whales and cows. And nothing religious about the fact that the observed sequence of fossil appearance in the geologic layers exactly matches the evolutionary prediction, while contradicting the creationist model. So as promised, I tried tonight to cover some of the scientific evidence supporting evolution. And perhaps some of you may be persuaded that some of this evidence is reasonable. Now, for those truly faithful in the audience who prefer an account of origins that satisfied their religious needs, I hope that you are persuaded that it is folly, even sacrilegious, to support your faith with a non-professional, invalid arguments offered by the ICR in its books, seminars, and debates. Instead, I hope you'll seek your inspiration from a much better book, one that's withstood the test of time and will surely outlast all of us, the Holy Bible. Thank you for your attention.
Now, many times here this evening, Dr. Max has mentioned unprofessional science or unprofessional this or unprofessional that. Let me ask you a question. When I documented the fact that every major kind of fish appears fully formed and there are no evolutionary ancestors that anybody has ever found, and I documented the fact from the evolutionary literature from Dr. Strahler that these various kind of fishes appear with no transitional forms linking them to a common ancestor. Is that unprofessional? I have stated the fact from the fossil record, and he said that's unprofessional science. That's what he believes. That's his religious belief, ladies and gentlemen. Don't let anybody kid you. That's his worldview. You heard him say he wants to exclude the teaching of the scientific evidence for creation from the public classroom. He wants to shut us out. He don't want them to hear what you've heard here tonight, what you've heard from Dr. Galuza, what you've heard from Dr. Parker, what you hear from our other scientists say that they are unscientific. We have some of the best geologists in the world there at ICR. We have Dr. John Baumgartner, who had an article published in the the U.S. News and World Report several years ago, and what a great scientist he was, and what tremendous accomplishment he has made, and his fellow geophysicists tremendously respect him. He is on our staff. He is scientific. He has great scientific credibility. We have scientists who are, all of us have had our doctorates from major universities, and we've been involved in scientific research. And he said we're unprofessional. Unprofessional. He said we have to take an oath at ICR. Look, we don't want theistic evolution to become and get on our staff and pretty soon start turning against us. Yes, we are a Christian organization. We don't try to hide that. The evolutionists, they want to hide the fact that they're atheists. Now, Eugenie Scott, for example, who heads this National Center for Science Education, she's telling her fellow evolutionists, don't mention anything. Don't say you can't, about this is against God. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't let people know that you're an atheist. She's let us know that she's an atheist. Well, no. We want Christians on our staff. Of course we do. Now, wait a minute. Do you have to take an oath to go on a university staff and take an oath that you're an evolutionist? No, you don't. But I'll tell you one thing I'll tell you this to be true. If you're on that staff and you don't have tenure, and they find out you're an evolutionist, you're out. You're gone. I mean, if they find out you're not a creationist, you are thrown out. They're never going to give you tenure. They don't have to sign an oath. They have an unwritten oath. We had people who got their master's degree at ICR and was accepted at a community college, and as soon as they found out he was a creationist, they canceled his contract. Are you sure you have to take an oath, an unwritten oath, that you're an evolutionist when you go to these universities, or they're going to kick you right out? And he admitted he wants to exclude us from the classrooms. Why? Why can't we have this evidence presented? We don't go into a classroom. Nobody's going to university with the book of Genesis or the Bible or anything like that. We go there with scientific evidence. I'm telling you, it's unbelievable what these people do down there in Cox County, Georgia. Here they were using textbooks at 120 pages on evolution. That's what one of the principals, what somebody said down there. And they want to put a disclaimer in these books. All it said was this, that evolution is a theory, it's not a fact. And students should be encouraged to critically examine the evidence. Period. And a federal judge threw that out, says that's religion. That is absolutely ridiculous. They wanted the students to examine this evidence critically and carefully. So they say that's religion. They don't want any challenge to evolution in any way. Dr. Max doesn't want that in the classroom. He doesn't want that in there because he knows that if it gets in there, they're going to lose, because the majority of students are going to be convinced that the evidence for creation is better than that for evolution. Now, he says something about, I believe he said something about our science is getting worse and worse, and, so forth. Maybe, listen, what have we been taught for the last 50 or 60 years in our biology classes? And what have we been taught? Evolution. Evolution, evolution. That's what we're taught in all this time. And if our students are getting worse and worse and worse, the problem is they're spending time studying all these just so stories and these made-up stories about how this evolved and that evolved, instead of studying biology, instead of studying the science that they were doing. Now, I went through the University of California at Los Angeles. I went through the University of California at Berkeley. 7 years. I'd already had 1 year before I started there. I went through that for 7 years and never heard the word evolution. You know what? We studied science. We worked on science. Our time was spent on doing science, not learning these just so stories and all this stuff about evolution. And I had a student going to university where she said she's taking courses in zoology. I said, I didn't learn any zoology. All I was taught was all this evolution stuff. And she left there and went to Christian Heritage College because she wanted to learn she wanted to learn some biology. We're spending our time and our students teaching all these just so stories about evolution. Years ago, I was on a program with Mike Wallace, and Ben Bova was there. I didn't know he was going to be there, but he was there, and we sort of had a debate. And I said, look, I said, an atheist, he doesn't have a choice. He has to believe in evolution. Later on, Mike Wallace turned to Mr. Bova and said, Mr. Bova, do you believe in God? And he says, no. He says, I guess you guys are the book burners, aren't you? What he said was, I guess you don't have a choice, do you? You have to believe in evolution. And then Mike Wallace later on asked me, do you want to get evolution out of the school? I said, absolutely not. That would violate the academic and religious freedoms of people who want to believe in evolution. We want to have both taught fairly. He turned to Mr. Bova and said, Mr. Bova, I guess you guys are the book burners, aren't you? These evolutionists are the book burners. Dr. Max would go into school and take those books out and burn them if they had any literature from our institute. They say we're unprofessional. I tell you one thing, these evolutionists don't understand the second law of thermodynamics and evolution. They just don't, and they say we don't understand it. They don't understand it. Well, there's much else we could say. And now listen, ladies and gentlemen. In our schools today, our kids are not being educated. They are being indoctrinated. They are being taught that evolution is a fact, not to be questioned, and not one word supporting creation is permitted, certainly not in the state of California. Now, when any theory in science freezes into dogma, that is bad science. That's poor education, ladies and gentlemen, what we have in the schools today. Now, to have the teachers, we're not saying that to require them to teach the evidence for creation. We say let them have the privilege of doing that if they wish. Give them the liberty to teach the evidence for creation. Let the students hear that. What's wrong with that? He says it's non-professional. That's what he said. These evolutionists, they are the elite. They are the intellectual elite. They have all the truth. They have control, you see. They decide what is true and what is not true. Oh, yes. We know all evolutionists believe in evolution. Yes, that's true. All evolutionists believe in evolution. But there's a lot of scientists who don't believe in evolution. And we have very good, solid evidence for our position. And to deny this to be taught in our public schools, in our pluralistic, democratic society, is anti-democratic. It violates the Constitution of the United States, which guarantees academic freedom. And what's more religious, a creator or no creator? What's more religious? If you insist that there's a creator or if you insist there's no creator. They're equally religious. They are worldviews. The evolutionists say, we are going to get our worldview, what we believe, in the schools, and yours are excluded. Now, like I say, it doesn't make any difference what the teacher personally believes. He could be a Christian. He could believe in God. But if he's teaching those kids that they came out of this big bang by an evolutionary process through all of that and so forth and so on, they're soon going to decide they don't need God. And that's what's happening in our school, in our country today. We've seen tremendous changes in our American society in the last 50 and 60 years. And I think it's because the judges, the educators, the legislators, the leaders in our society have been indoctrinated in evolutionary theory. They've accepted this philosophy, this religion, and their decisions are based upon that religion. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Hey, this has been healthy, hasn't it? And again, I thank Dr. Max for coming. All right, that concludes our evening. Thank you. Thank you.